Today I'm taking a £2,000 gaming PC, removing the graphics card, and seeing if Intel's UHD 770 integrated graphics can actually handle gaming. We're using the i9 13900K and 64GB of DDR5 RAM. But without a GPU, is it playable or completely hopeless? Let's find out. Right, first up we've got Shadow of the Tomb Raider running at 1080p on low settings with depth of field and motion blur turned off. I've also switched on Intel XeSS in performance mode just to give the UHD 770 as much help as possible. And honestly, yeah, this one is a little bit rough. We're not exactly starting with a smooth victory lap here. And because it's a 2018 game, I was hoping that the UHD 770 might just about cope. But apparently that was a little bit optimistic. So the i9 13900K is definitely not the issue here. It's a 13th gen beast with 24 cores and 32 threads. That's 8 performance cores, 16 efficient cores and a boost speed up to 5.8 gig. And for productivity, this thing is an absolute monster. But gaming without a dedicated GPU is a very different story indeed. In this benchmark, Shadow of the Tomb Raider averages just 25 FPS, with both the 1% and 0.1% lows at 22 FPS. So yeah, it technically does run, but it's not a great experience.
You may lose contact.
Now, moving on to Red Dead Redemption running at 1080p on low settings with motion blur switched off and FXAA enabled. Now, before we jump into the results, we need to talk about the elephant in the room. Power consumption. The 13900K is a seriously powerful CPU, and at its full PL2 power level it can pull up to 253 watts, which is quite a lot for a CPU. So when you hit it with heavy or core workloads, it can kick out a lot of heat. Basically, if you want to keep the boost clocks high and avoid thermal throttling, decent cooling is definitely important. Unless you want your PC doubling up as a small space heater. Even though the 13900K is a few generations old now, there's still loads of CPU horsepower. So with all that power behind it, how does Red Dead Redemption 2 actually run on the UHD 770? Honestly, surprisingly well. 1080p on low settings it averages 61 FPS, with 1% lows of 53 FPS and 0.1% lows of 50. Next up we've got Hollow Knight Silksong, running at 1080p, and now this game doesn't really have the usual graphics settings you'd get in bigger AAA titles. But honestly that's not really a bad thing here, as this is exactly where indie games can make a lot of sense on a setup like this. They're usually much less demanding, and instead of trying to melt your graphics card, they focus more on art style, gameplay and just being fun to play. That makes a game like Silksong a pretty perfect match for integrated graphics, especially when the CPU is as overpowered as the 13900K. The CPU itself is obviously complete overkill for a game like this, so the real question is whether the UHD 770 can actually keep things smooth and consistent. And the answer is yes, very much so. At 1080p resolution we're getting an average of 138 FPS. Almost maxing out my monitor, and with a 1% low of 88 FPS and a 0.1% low of 32 FPS. So after Tomb Raider nearly turned this into a PowerPoint presentation, Silksong is a much nicer result for the UHD 770. Next we've got Grand Theft Auto 5 Legacy at 1080p using normal settings with FXAA enabled. I've also maxed out population density, population variety and distance scaling just to make Los Santos feel a bit busier and give the poor little UHD 770 a bit more to deal with. The UHD 770 iGPU is found in Intel's 12th, 13th and 14th generation desktop processors, including chips like the i9 13900K. So, even if you buy a seriously powerful CPU, that doesn't automatically mean the built-in graphics are powerful too. The UHD 770 is more of a safety net than a gaming solution. It gives you display output. helps with setup and troubleshooting, and means the system can still work even if you haven't installed a graphics card yet. Useful, definitely, but for tearing around Los Santos causing absolute chaos, not really. But where's the fun in playing it safe? In Grand Theft Auto 5, the UHD 770 actually does manage a decent average of 48 FPS with a 1% low of 39 and a 0.1% low of 37. So, for integrated graphics in GTA 5, that's honestly not bad at all. It's actually pretty smooth here and definitely more playable than I expected. Now we're jumping into Fortnite at 1080p on low settings, with motion blur turned off, and I'm also using the performance rendering mode. But I've kept the resolution scale at 100%, so it's still rendering at full 1080p. And one thing worth mentioning here is that the 770 doesn't have its own dedicated VRAM. Instead, it borrows part of the system memory, and in a build like this, that means it's working with 64GB of DDR5 running at 6,000 mega transfers per second. That sounds handy, and it actually is. But it does come with a few minor limits. Performance can depend on how much system memory you've got, how fast it is, and how much of it the integrated graphics can actually use. You can actually tweak some BIOS settings to give the iGPU more resources, including changing how much system memory is reserved for it. But for this test I wanted to see what this 770 could do without any extra help. So, no secret sauce, no wizardry, just straight out the box performance. And in Fortnite the result is actually decent. We're averaging 55 FPS, so it doesn't quite hit that 60 FPS target. The 1% lows come in at 31 FPS, while the 0.1% lows is 27 FPS. Next up, we've got Fallout 4 Game of the Year edition running at 1080p on low settings with depth of field set to bokeh and motion blur turned off. Now, the UHD 770 isn't just there to stop your monitor from being a very expensive black rectangle. It also comes with Intel QuickSync, which is basically a dedicated video feature built into integrated graphics. In simple terms, QuickSync helps with encoding and decoding video. So for streaming, recording, high-resolution playback or editing in apps like DaVinci Resolve and Premiere Pro, QuickSync can take some of that work off the CPU, instead of making the poor thing carry the whole video workload like it lost a bet. It doesn't turn the 770 into a gaming monster, but for media work and everyday video tasks, QuickSync is generally one of the best things about Intel's integrated graphics. As for Fallout 4 itself, we're looking at an average of 38 FPS. With a 1% low of 27 FPS and a 0.1% low of 13 FPS. So yes, it runs and it can play it, but those lows are a little reminder that this is still an iGPU doing its absolute best. If you're enjoying watching this poor little iGPU get dragged through the games that it was never designed for, consider subscribing, because apparently I enjoy making computers suffer for entertainment purposes. And now time for Cyberpunk 2077, at 1080p on low settings with depth of field and motion blur turned off. I've also enabled AMD FSR 3 in performance mode. So, the game is being upscaled from around 540p, and this is where the 770 really starts to show its limits. Also, it's a good reminder that integrated graphics only go so far in workstation style tasks. If you're doing serious 3D work in something like Blender or CAD, then the UHD 770 can become a pretty big bottleneck. The main problem is that it just doesn't have the raw graphics power needed for heavy creative workloads, so it starts to struggle once things get demanding. That can really hurt performance when dealing with complex 3D models, large scenes or GPU accelerated effects. Basically the sort of stuff that makes an iGPU quietly regret its life choices. And if your software benefits from NVIDIA specific features like CUDA, which some Blender and creative workloads actually do, then the 770 obviously can't help with that either. So for basic 3D work, it'll just about get by. But if 3D rendering is a major part of your workload, a dedicated GPU is going to make a massive difference. As for Cyberpunk performance-wise, yeah, this one's not exactly great. Driving around at this frame rate is a bit of a nightmare. That's if I can actually drive at all. And honestly, I'd call it unplayable, but of course, that doesn't stop me from trying. The results speak for themselves, a very cinematic 24 FPS average, with a 1% low of 17 and a 0.1% low of 13 FPS. And now of course, we had to try Crysis. I'm running at 1080p on medium settings, with motion blur turned off and 2x anti-aliasing enabled to help clean up some of those jagged edges. And honestly, considering Crysis is now around 19 years old, you would expect this to run fine. And it does. But still, it's always funny seeing the old Can It Run Crysis meme get dragged out yet again. Anyway, another thing worth mentioning is that integrated graphics performance isn't just about raw FPS. Driver support and game compatibility also matter as well. Some games behave perfectly fine on Intel integrated graphics, while others can have weird issues, missing options, stutters, or just generally not feel as polished as they would on stronger gaming hardware. And that's especially true with newer games, when developers are usually optimizing for Nvidia, AMD and proper Intel Arc GPUs, not necessarily the little UHD 770. As for Crysis itself, we're getting an average of 78 FPS, with a 1% low of 49 FPS and a 0.1% low of 17 FPS. So yes, the UHD 770 can actually run Crysis. Next up we've got Call of Duty Black Ops 7, and this was less of a benchmark and more of a stress test for the Intel little iGPU. I'm running it at 1080p on the minimum settings, with depth of field and motion blur both turned off, and I've also enabled AMD FSR 3 in ultra performance mode, which means the game is actually rendering internally at 360p. And even with all those compromises, the bigger problem isn't just the low FPS. It's how the game actually feels. The input response is delayed, aiming feels heavy, and every gunfight feels like I'm reacting half a second too late. You can sometimes put up with low graphics, but when movement and aiming feels this sluggish, the whole thing stops feeling playable very quickly. I did eventually get a kill. I won't say it was clean, but realistically, this is way far beyond what the UHD 770 can actually handle. It averages just 19 FPS with a 1% low of 12 and a 0.1% low of 11 FPS. Finally, we've got Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. The original 2013 release running at 1080p on low settings with motion blur turned off and FXAA enabled. It averages 41 FPS with a 1% low of 23 and a 0.1% low of 15 FPS. So, after all that punishment, is no GPU gaming actually playable? The answer is yes, but only if you go with the right expectations. Pick older games, indie titles or lighter stuff, and the UHD 770 can still give you a surprisingly decent experience. So, the UHD 770 kind of makes sense as a backup, a temporary stopgap, or a way to squeeze some gaming out of a workstation when you've got no graphics card installed. It's not a dream gaming setup, but it's the emergency touch that you find in a drawer when the power goes out. And outside of gaming, the i9-13900K, 64GB of DDR5 RAM, and Intel QuickSync still make this a seriously capable productivity and media machine. It just so happens to be wearing gaming shoes that are several sizes too small. So no, I wouldn't build a gaming PC like this on purpose, but as a weird little experiment, the UHD 770 did way better than it had any right to. Let me know in the comments what game you'd want me to test next on the UHD 770, and whether I should try round 2 with a few altered BIOS settings. So, if your GPU dies, don't panic. The 770 probably won't save the day, but it might at least keep you entertained a while you panic to buy a replacement. Anyway, I'm David James. Thanks for watching this weird little no GPU experiment, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.